what we basically have been doing is we've been going through looking at the life of Jacob. And we've been looking at his search for identity. And we've begun to see the beginnings of the opening of his heart towards God. And what we saw last week, as we journeyed through this together last week, we saw God's amazing, unmerited blessings that were given to Jacob. And in response to those blessings, you might think that Jacob would have said, "Oh, God, thank you. Like, you're such an awesome God. Thank you for your many blessings." But instead, what we saw last week is Jacob's response was to ask for more blessing and placing conditions on his own surrender to God in light of the blessings that he had received. And so we were challenged last week to take note of our blessings. For those that were here, you had an opportunity to write down, Justin, sorry to bother you. I need those lights on again, the meet and greet lights up here. Thanks. That way y'all can see down here in the front. So, hopefully that helps. There we go. Spin, turn. Anyway, hopefully that helps. Where was I? Oh, so we were looking at Jacob's situation, and we looked at his life, and we were challenged to take note of our blessings, take an opportunity to write down some of the ways that we feel that God has blessed us, and to allow those blessings to remind us of our need to surrender to Him. And I gave you an opportunity last week to write down some of the ways and the places where you feel that God may be leading you to a deeper place and a different spot of surrender in your walk with Him. This morning, we're going to wrap up our time looking at the life of Jacob. Yes, we're getting done with Jacob. And we're going to look at his continued journey towards significance. And we're going to cover quite a few chapters in doing so. And we're going to basically do a kind of a flyover, and we're going to highlight some important and significant themes. And each of these scenes of Jacob's life that we're going to look at has a life lesson that's going to come with it. And so I'm going to give you 7 life lessons, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, so I'm not going to spend 15 minutes on each one of them, just 14 minutes. No, I'm not going to do that. So, but there'll be 7 life lessons for each of these different stories that we look at. So let's jump into it. And I'm hoping and praying that God will challenge us and encourage us and show us some things that He has for us as we look at the life of Jacob. So the first thing that we notice is in Genesis chapter 29. And if you want to open your Bible there, you can. When there's some relevant scriptures, I'm going to throw them up on the screen. But I want to just kind of give you a little bit of an overview of what's going on here. In Genesis chapter 9, what we find is Jacob meets Rachel, who would soon be one of his wives. And this is the scene here is I've entitled it Watering the Sheep. And it's a really unusual story because Jacob arrives in a place where the shepherds and the sheep here in the fields in this area would be gathered and they'd be watered from this well. And it was their tradition as shepherds to wait until all the flocks had gathered, and then they'd roll this stone away from the well, and then they would water all the animals when they were there. Because it took a lot of effort, apparently, to move this huge stone away from the well. And so they just wanted to do it once a day and have everybody there to participate in the one time so they didn't have to continue to do it over and over throughout the day. But Jacob, he shows up in this place, unannounced, right? And he sees Rachel, and he wants to have some alone time with Rachel. And so he asks the shepherds that are there, "Hey, why don't you guys go ahead and water the sheep? Essentially water the sheep and then hightail it out of here so I can spend time with Rachel." And but this would break their tradition. This wasn't the way that they did it. As shepherds, this was their job, their vocation. They knew what was the most effective way to accomplish this. And so they said, Jacob, we don't operate that way. We don't do things that way. We wait until, they explained to him how it works. But because of his own desire to have alone time with Rachel, he basically takes things into his own hands. And despite being told not to do so, he removes the stone from the well and he waters Rachel's sheep. This is what he wanted to do, and so he went ahead and took liberty to do what he wanted to do. It didn't matter what the impact was on the people around him.
And so what we find here is this continued theme that showed up, if you've been with us the last couple of weeks, this continued theme of Jacob's own self-centeredness, his self-centered way of life. It doesn't matter that there are rules to follow, and for these shepherds, in order to do their job, these rules were put into place in the right ways. It doesn't matter about any of that, because this rule or this way of operation inconveniences Jacob, and so he does what he wants anyway. So the first life lesson that we get from this story, from this vignette, I guess you could say, of Jacob's life this morning is, I just titled it, Break Free from the Egomania, right? There's this idea that as long as we live in a place of wanting ourselves to be in control, we cause damage. We'll talk about this more as we move on. We're going to cause damage to people around us. We need to learn to break free from the self-centered existence that is so natural to our sin-oriented nature. It is a natural byproduct of sin in us that craves to be first and foremost in our decision-making. And that is one of the main reasons why the very first commandment that God gives Moses is that you shall have no other gods before me. It wasn't just, don't make these images of God and worship them and say that's what it means to not have any other gods, or to say I want to worship many other gods in terms of all these other deities. That was certainly a part of that command. But I think in the very, very heartbeat of God, at the very first giving of those 10 commandments, there was an understanding and a recognition that the heart of men and women is naturally prone to sinful expressions of wanting to elevate themselves, to place themselves on the throne and authority of their lives. And so God says, don't have any other gods, including yourself, probably first and foremost, above me. We weren't created for that. We were created to live in submission and under the obedience and the loving care of our God, our Creator. And so Jacob is still trying to figure that out, right? He's still trying to understand this as we move along. So the first life lesson, again, break free from egomania. So the second story that we come across here in Genesis is the story of Rachel and Leah. Now, this story is very interesting because what we find here is that Jacob gets a piece of his own medicine here. A man well acquainted with deception and manipulation, Jacob is now going to be the one played by his uncle Laban. It's a very interesting story. Jacob meets up with Laban, so he went with Rachel back to her house and meets her father Laban at this point, and which is ultimately Jacob's dad's brother, so it's his uncle, and he stays with them for about a month. Jacob stays with Laban and his family for about a month working. And Laban wants to pay Jacob for his work. It's like, man, I'm getting all this free labor out of this guy. He's been with us for a month. I probably should pay this guy something. But instead of asking for money, basically Laban says, what should I do here? What do you want? And Jacob says, I don't want you to pay me. I just want you to give me your daughter's hand in marriage. I want to marry Rachel. And so Jacob tells Laban, say, hey, how about this deal? I'll work for you for 7 years in return to marry your daughter Rachel. And so Laban agrees to this. And when the time of the marriage occurs after 7 years of working, Laban gives his other daughter Leah to Jacob instead on their wedding night. Jacob calls out Laban on his deception and says, man, what did you do? I mean, I worked for 7 years for Rachel, and then I woke up in the bed next to me, and there was Leah, right? And Laban gives some excuse for why he deceived Jacob. He says, well, Jacob, I didn't tell you this, but after all, it's actually not our custom to give the younger daughter away before the older daughter. So you get Leah first. And then Laban says, I'll give you Rachel, but only on this other condition. After the time of the wedding occurs, I think it says something in the scriptures about another week or week and a half later, I'll give you Rachel as your wife as well, on the condition that you will work for me for another 7 years as well, to have both of my daughters now. It reminds me of this story in the New Testament that Jesus doesn't tell it. It's a part of the experience of Jesus on the night he was betrayed, where they were being approached by the soldiers and for Jesus to be arrested. And Peter draws his sword. You remember that story? If you remember, if you've paid attention to or been a part of services where you've been listening to or been a part of the Easter story, this is sometimes something that comes up in those accounts. And so Peter draws out his sword and he cuts off the ear of one of the arresting soldiers. And Jesus commands Peter, right? He's being zealous, right? He's like, you can't take Jesus. I'm going to forcefully deny you from doing that. And Jesus commands Peter to put away his sword. And he tells him this. He tells Peter, he says, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And so put another way, in this context, this same teaching applies in this context with Jacob. If you are a deceiver, if you deceive, there's a good chance that you're going to find yourself being deceived in life as well. For whatever reason, it's just what comes around goes around, as the saying goes, right? And so what we learn in this little vignette, this little story, the life lesson, is that we reap what we sow. And so we should be sowing the right things, right? Jesus gives a parable about this as well. We should be investing in the things that we want to grow in, the areas that are valuable and important in our relationship with God. And when we sow the wrong things, when we invest in the wrong things, when we give energy and attention to the wrong ways of living, then we reap the wonderful benefits of those negative things, don't we? I mean, many of us have experienced that in our lives. And so the life lesson here, we reap what we sow, so let's sow the right things. There's a third story that shows up here in this section of Scripture, and it has to do with Jacob's children. Genesis chapter 30 gives us the account of the birth of Jacob's children by either Leah or Rachel, now both of his wives, or Leah and Rachel's servants, okay? And so this is a very interesting chapter because there's so much conflict in this chapter. There's so much jealousy that's here. So let me just kind of paint the picture here of what's going on. Leah, okay, so Leah, always playing second fiddle to his sister in terms of in Jacob's eyes, right? Leah's well aware that Jacob's been working for 7 years for her sister. And then what's she thinking when Jacob looks over at her on their wedding night and says, oh my goodness, who are you in bed with me, right? It's like she's probably feeling pretty bummed about, well, I'm disappointed. My new husband here didn't even know he's marrying me, got me instead of my sister. And so she has been living in this shadow. And she is giving birth giving birth to Jacob's children because she's desperately hoping that because of her fruitfulness in bearing sons, that she will win her husband's love, that she'll win Jacob's love by doing this. Rachel, on the other hand, is jealous of Leah's success because she can't have children. And she's so jealous that she gives her servant to her husband Jacob to have children for her. And thereby then creating this competition that starts to ensue between Rachel and Leah. Who can outbirth children here? And then the 12 tribes of Israel actually come out of this, right? That's where, if you're aware of the 12 tribes of Israel, that's the descendants of Jacob's children that come out of this particular experience here. And so both Leah and Rachel are seeking the same significance that Jacob is seeking. They're searching for their significance. They're looking for their significance in either the love that Jacob has for them or in their ability to have children. When the need for their own significance and value is not met through these external things, it results in conflict and jealousy. And even in one case in this story, if you read it a little deeper, what you find is that Leah actually prostitutes herself to Jacob. It leads to that situation. I so desperately want the love of my husband that I would actually pay money to go sleep with him one night instead of Rachel. It's essentially what happens. You see, when Jacob is not finding his identity and significance in God alone, it has negative ramifications on everybody around him. From his father, right? If you remember the story of Jacob, we've gone through. So his father was negatively impacted because of Jacob's search for significance. His brother's life was negatively impacted. Now his wives and his children. And so the life lesson from this little vignette is kind of a long one I put down here. But a failure to find one's identity and significance in being a deeply beloved child of God not only wrecks our own lives, but leads to dysfunction and pain for those around us, especially for those we are leading. Let that sink in a little bit there. A failure to find our identity and significance as a deeply beloved child of God not only wrecks our own lives, but leads to dysfunction and pain for those around us, especially for those we are leading. Our search for significance and finding it in the wrong places does not impact only me. It creates problems for everybody in my sphere around me, my sphere of influence around me. You've probably seen that as well, right? We know this in our families, in our relationships, right? Why is there so much conflict in our families and relationships among loved ones, coworkers at work, whatever it may be? Most often it's this search for significance, this search for meaning, what it can be seen as valuable or important, trying to find one's identity in what they do and how they perform. And when those needs aren't met, it results in conflict and dysfunction with people around them and around us. That's an experience that we deal with on a consistent basis in the conflict of our relationships. Let's move on to the fourth story that we see here, the fourth little teaching vignette, I guess you could say, and that's Jacob and Laban's conflict. So in Genesis chapter 30 and 31, we find an increasing conflict developing among Jacob and Laban. So again, Laban is his uncle, father of both Rachel and Leah, the man who he's worked for, and that kind of deceived him into working an additional 7 years for Rachel. What we find here is that both Jacob and Laban are deceivers, and so they're doing what they do best, right? They're deceiving, they're manipulating. Jacob believes that Laban has used him and has not been fair to him. And so Jacob resorts to dishonest practices, either out of necessity or out of greed or both. I don't know for sure exactly. But he resorts to dishonest practices with his uncle Laban. He reaches an agreement with Laban to get what he thinks he deserves. There's this whole dialogue going on. It's like, man, I've been working with you forever, and I don't have anything to show for it. Man, you're becoming wealthy. Jacob's telling his uncle, you're becoming wealthy off of my back, and I'm not getting anything from this, right? And so he reaches this agreement with Laban where he says basically, hey, Laban, let's call it this way. Let's do it this way. You give me all the spotted or speckled animals from your flocks as payment. Let me have these ones that maybe aren't seen as valuable. Let me have them. And so Laban agrees. Okay, I'll give Jacob these speckled or spotted animals. But then Jacob, very interesting little passage here, Jacob, in true dishonest form, peels off the bark of trees and places them in spots where Laban's animals would mate and have birth. So thereby producing spotted offspring from Laban's animals, right? So they give birth, they're around all these bushes and stuff, it puts markings on the animals. He did that intentionally. He's like, boom, look at that, we got another spotted animal. Boom, we got another one, right? And so this allowed Jacob to become very rich and very wealthy off of Laban's back. This is hardly what Laban had in mind when he agreed to this, right? And then Jacob basically ups and leaves. He takes off. He leaves Laban. He takes all of the newly acquired flocks that he has now, along with his wives and all of these children that he's had. And he takes off, and he doesn't tell Laban, which according to custom in that day was an act of deception. He didn't have the right to just up and leave. There was even, Laban still retained certain aspects of property that Jacob was taking. And so Laban pursues Jacob. And when he meets him, he confronts him. He says, dude, you left without saying goodbye. You took my children, my daughters and my grandchildren are gone, like overnight. And notice Jacob's response to Laban in Genesis 31:31. I've got this on the screen. Jacob answered Laban, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. Finally, Jacob is honest about something, right? I was afraid. The life lesson that we see from this story is that when we're not living within our identity as a beloved child of God, we are fearful. When we are not living in our identity as a beloved child of God, we are fearful. Why? Because we have built the foundation of our identity on the wrong things. When we build the foundation of our identity, and we've talked about this the last couple of weeks as we've talked about the life of Jacob, when we build our foundation on how much money we have, how much property we have, how powerful we are, how much influence we have, when those things are gone or they're threatened, we're fearful because we lose some of our identity with that. When our identity is founded in the right place, as a beloved child of God, we don't have to fear the loss of worldly goods. We don't have to fear the loss of influence because our identity is still intact. Whether you're liked or not liked, whether you're seen as successful or unsuccessful, whether you have a lot of money or no money, your identity is still intact as a beloved child of God because your identity is not based on performance. It's not based on those external measures. At the end of the day, we are deeply loved and cared for no matter what the situation in life brings us. And to make it even better, we're deeply cared and loved irregardless of how screwed up we've made life for us, for ourselves, our choices. We're not despised. We're not thrown away because we commit adultery, because we've manipulated somebody out of money, because we've taken the life of another person. Whatever it is, we've lied, we've cheated, we've stealed, whatever it may be. Our identity is not wrapped up in our sin. It's not wrapped up in our movement away from God, our wrong choices. Our identity is founded in who God is, not in who we are. And so Jacob here is learning this lesson. He is fearful. He's afraid that his deception is caught up to him. For Jacob, everything is wrapped up in his material wealth. It's wrapped up in his wives, in his children, because after all, frankly, his children are insurance of a successful family line. And if that is threatened, because he finds his identity in it, fear becomes a natural result. But again, let's give Jacob some credit here because at least Jacob is being honest now. He's acknowledging the fact that he's afraid. There's something in Laban's pursuit of him that gets Jacob's attention. And he's honest about his fear. He was probably also afraid when Laban came to his camp. Right when he showed up at that front door. He was not so afraid that his children would be taken away, but imagine when he first finds out that Laban's there, when he opens up his tent and he's like, oh my goodness, there's Laban. What's he thinking? He's probably not thinking, I'm afraid that my wives and children are going to be taken away. He's like afraid of his own life. What's this guy going to do to me? But the chapter ends in a very encouraging way because Laban and Jacob make a covenant with each other. And they resolve their conflict and they part ways in peace. Reconciliation, restoration occurs between these two deceptive individuals. This sense of fear that Jacob has in relation to Laban, Laban's pursuit of him and the fear that Jacob felt when that happened, and the way in which the conflict is resolved, leads Jacob to likely think about who? He's thinking about his brother. Me and Esau, man, we've been at odds for a long time. Interesting that Laban pursues me and we're able to reconcile. And so Jacob, I think God uses this for Jacob to begin the process of healing for what's going to happen with his brother Esau as well. And so let's move on to that aspect of the story. Jacob prepares to meet his brother. Genesis chapter 32, 3 through 12. It'll be on the screen. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he instructed them, "This is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my lord that I might find favor in your eyes." When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." Okay, Jacob and Esau had a pretty tough situation, right? Right? I don't presume that you know this. If you're with us the last couple of weeks, we've talked about this. Jacob basically manipulated and deceived his brother Esau his whole life. Stole his birthright, manipulated his blessing, lied to his father. Esau was so angry he wanted to kill Jacob, and Jacob had to flee. Rebekah said, "Jacob, you got to get out of here. Your brother wants to kill you." Jacob knows that Esau is ticked off. And he gets this message in return, right? Jacob knows that there's an inevitable meeting with his brother that's coming. Based on where he's going, he knows he's going to cross paths with Esau. And he sends this message of peace. And then his messengers bring back this message that he's coming with 400 men, an army. This is an army. How would you interpret this? Put yourself in Jacob's shoes, right? I mean, in his sandals. How would you interpret this? Look at what Jacob did. Verse 7. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. And he thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape, right? So he's thinking, okay, I'm planning here. Like, if my brother comes and tries to kill me, at least I won't have everybody lost, right? I've got two groups, right? Only one will be destroyed. Verse 9, then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. Verse 10, I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. I love the words in this prayer that Jacob has with God. He says, I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Notice Jacob's change in attitude. If you follow the story of Jacob, this is a significant shift in the way that he approaches God and thinks of God and operates around God. He puts forth his unworthiness, this place of humility. I'm unworthy. He ascribes kindness and faithfulness to God. He sees himself as God's servant now. And he gives credit to God for everything he has, right? Whereas before it had been like, man, look at what I did. Look at all this stuff I did. How smart I am to accumulate all these things. That thing with the whole, like the tree bark down by the water, like that was pretty smart, right? Look at what I did. I made a name for myself. I got all these extra animals out of this thing, right? But instead, he reflects and he gives God credit for all that he has. And then he says, save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid that he's going to come and attack me. And also the mothers with their children. Jacob's afraid. And this fear is greater than the fear that he had for his uncle Laban. It's had more time to fester, hasn't it? Jacob is at the end of his rope. He's unsure what's going to happen when Esau arrives. But he's sure that if Esau attacks with his 400 men, they will be destroyed. He's not prepared for that. Jacob is at the end of his rope, And he's now ready to surrender to God and trust him for his help. Isn't this the way in which God seems to reach many of us? It's when our relentless pursuit to keep ourselves on the throne, to maintain our own control and authority of our lives, when that works for a while, right? It works for a while, and then something happens that knocks us off of our rocker, and we're like, wow, I really can't control my life. I really can't fix this on my own. And draws us into the presence of God. The life lesson that we see here is that God meets us in our brokenness and fear. God is close to the brokenhearted. He meets us in our brokenness and fear, and he does it in unconditional ways. This is always mind-blowing to me. Left to human beings, we would take somebody like Jacob and say, oh, now you want my help. Nope. You should have given me credit for that stuff a long time ago. You should have surrendered, should have not made demands of me for more blessings. You should have done these things. Instead, God says, you know what? I long to have you recognize your brokenness. I long to have you submit yourself to me so that I can love you and provide for you and show you what life looks like, how life is intended to be lived. And I will walk with you in those places of brokenness and fear. You know, sometimes the greatest gifts and blessings in our lives are when we're confronted with our own inability to fix our stuff, right? When we come to the end of our ropes. Because it's in that place that God meets us and teaches us. He saves us and he helps us and he reaffirms his love for us. And he says, not by your strength will this be done, but by my strength this will be done. We need, in many ways, to get to the end of our ropes in order to see the rope that God is giving to us. That's how it works. It's a hard thing to do, but this is sometimes why it is beneficial to pray for brokenness. It's beneficial to pray for pain, for struggle. Because in the great irony of life, this is where true hope and healing begins. God meets us in our brokenness and fear. The sixth vignette is Jacob's encounter with God. Look at verse 22. I think we're still in 31, aren't we? I've lost track of what chapter we're in. 32, thank you. 32, verse 22. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And after he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When that man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. God answers. Now remember, this is in the context of Jacob praying this prayer. Remember, we just talked about that, where, God, I'm not worthy of this, right? Please rescue me, I'm afraid. This is how God answers Jacob's prayer. He appears to him and has a wrestling match with him. Because why not, you know? I don't know. He answers his prayer by having this appearance in wrestling with him and inflicting pain on him and giving him a limp and giving him a new name. And he blesses him. What's most significant in this account is the issue of pain and a new name. Jacob's name was changed from Jacob, which means the one who grasps the heel, which was what happened at the birth of Jacob and Esau, right? Which is a very significant name because it indicates the struggle of Jacob's life, to always want to be somebody he wasn't, wanting to be first, grabbing, no, Esau, get back in the womb, I'm coming out first, right? And so his name communicated that. That's what the name of Jacob means. He grasps the heel, and his name is changed to Israel, which means he struggles with God. No longer is Jacob identified by his desire to be his brother, to find his identity in worshiping himself. God has renamed him in relationship with God. And God has also identified the nature of that relationship, which has been struggle. He doesn't paint a nice little picture over it, right? Jacob, the one who struggles with God. That's what your life has been about. He is a beloved child of God, but his relationship has been characterized as a struggle. It's a struggle to die to himself and to find himself and surrender to his Creator. That's what he's struggling with. Ongoing, his life has been that struggle. And to the day he dies, that will be his struggle. And for many of us, to the day we die, that is our struggle. God inflicts pain on Jacob, not as punishment, not as a way to beat him up, not as a way to, because he's wrathful and vengeful towards him and wants to hurt him, but he inflicts pain on Jacob so that Jacob has a constant reminder of his struggle and a constant reminder of his need and his dependency on God. Every time Jacob limps, it is an indication of his inability to do it on his own. And that happens every other step. His limp is a gift from God to help him reorient his life back to self-denial and giving lordship to his Creator. So the life lesson that we have in this sixth story is that God gifts us with pain, and he gifts us with a new name. God has given us new names. He has also given us pain. Sometimes, as the story of Jacob shows, sometimes inflicted by God himself. Other times, just allowing it in the natural course of life to experience and for us to experience. But again, God's use of pain is never done in a manipulative way, and it's never done in a way that he's trying to hurt you or I. He's trying to destroy us. That he's trying to appease some sort of sadistical, mindset of God that he wants to overpower and dominate us and beat us up into submission. But he inflicts or allows pain because it is ultimately a gift that leads us to daily surrender, to living in dependency on God as our healer, our helper, and Lord. The cancerous effects of self-will demand such a response. Our proclivity, our movement towards wanting to be in control is an ongoing daily battle for all of us in this room. It's so dangerous that it impacts us to the core of our being when we're not even paying attention to it, when we just operate naturally in the course of our lives. That is why pain can be a gift in the midst of that struggle. We don't like it. I don't know anybody in this room that likes pain. I sure don't. I'd much rather have God use another measure. But I will tell you that my own experiences have been the greatest joy, healing, and life has come through the deepest areas of pain. I can't fully explain that other to know that God knows his purposes, and he knows that he wants to bring us to life. And for some reason, that pain and the sacrifice, the crucifixion of ourself kind of go hand in hand. And we need it. We need it so that we're not continually dependent on ourselves to make this life work. The last one we want to look at is Jacob and Esau's reconciliation. The time has now come for Jacob to be reunited to his brother. Not knowing how Esau is going to receive him, Jacob approaches Esau in extreme humility, bowing 7 times before he reaches his brother. But Esau, I love the response of Esau. Esau will have none of it. Esau runs to his brother Jacob and kisses him and hugs him and cries with him. Oh. Jacob says, but I'm not worthy of this. Like, I screwed you over. And he says, please accept all these delegations of gifts that I've sent you. Because he sent him all these delegations, all this cattle. He's like, okay, send that group and that wave and give it to him, and then we'll have a little bit of a break and there'll be another wave of cattle that'll go, right? And Esau was like, dude, what's up with all the cattle? And Jacob says, please accept this as a gift. And Esau says, I don't want your gift. I don't need it. It's not necessary. Jacob has found his own significance. He's been healed in some different places, right? He's no longer holding on to that hurt and that pain and that anger and that hatred for his brother. There's healing that's occurred for him as well. But eventually he accepts those gifts because Jacob is so insistent that his brother have these things. So he says, okay, that's going to make you feel better. I'll take it. But not out of a need for having it. But Jacob says to Esau, he says, please accept these presents that I brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all that I need. Jacob has been touched by God, and he recognizes the gift of God in this peaceful reunion with his brother, as well as all the blessings that God has given him. And so this last life lesson is this, that many times the gifts of reconciliation and restoration with both God and others can only come through pain and brokenness. Let me tell you, if you've got a situation with a loved one, a coworker, or somebody where there's brokenness and a need for reconciliation, healing will come as you bring yourself to that place and stop needing to try to have them do it first, or have there to be conditions met on your place before you forgive. A place of brokenness before God, recognizing the great gift of His forgiveness for us, can lead us to have the strength to not only seek healing from God in our relationship with Him, but for those around us where relationships have been broken and need to be restored. We look to avoid pain and brokenness, but these two gifts are most needed to keep us grounded and open, dependent and humble before God. Pain and brokenness are necessary for our lives, as much as we hate to say it, much as we don't want to believe it. It's true. Jacob's life was a rocky road. It was a rocky road to God that was made difficult by his own stubbornness and his own self-centeredness. So we can be thankful for the journey of Jacob as an example in some ways of how not to do things, but also as an example of the joy and the gift of surrender and healing, and how pain can bring us to those places. I don't fully understand it. All I know is that the scriptures seem to teach that. The stories and the accounts of people seem to indicate that. And so as we close this morning, here are those, I'm going to give you those 7 life lessons here again. Life lesson 1, break free from the egomania. Life lesson 2, we reap what we sow. Let's sow the right things. Life lesson 3, a failure to find one's identity and significance in being a deeply beloved child of God not only wrecks our own lives, but leads to dysfunction and pain for those around us, especially for those we are leading. Life lesson 4, when we are not living within our identity as a beloved child of God, we are fearful. Life lesson 5, God meets us in our brokenness and fear. Life lesson 6, God gifts us with pain and a new name. Life lesson 7, many times the gifts of reconciliation and restoration with both God and others can only come through our pain and brokenness. Father, we thank you for the life of Jacob. We thank you that we're able to read about these experiences through the Scriptures. Poor guy probably didn't think he was going to have his life on display for millions and millions of people for thousands and thousands of years. We thank you for what you can teach us through Jacob's life. In many ways, like it or not, our lives parallel Jacob's lives. An ongoing journey to find our significance. The temptation to find it in the things around us, the things we possess, how people feel about us, the outward signs of success. Only to find all that stuff comes breaking down around us and we're left with nothing. And it's in that place of nothing and brokenness that you meet us and you say, "Hello, my child. Welcome back." Would you help us to daily live in that place of surrender and openness and dependency on you? Because it is there that we know that we experience true life and true healing, not only in relationship with you, but in our relationships with people around us. In Jesus' name, amen.